Once upon a time, there was a country, and it could have gone either way. In 1926, Ireland was both a new independent state and a dominion of the British Empire. There had been a civil war. There had been partition. So not everything had gone according to plan. In fact, there was no plan. It was hard to know if the Free State meant the freedom to go forward into the modern world or back to the happy time before there were Protestants. Yeats was a Protestant. He was also the most famous poet in the world. In 1923, William Butler Yeats had been awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. Yeats said he accepted the prize
as part of Europe's welcome to the Free State.
In Ireland, Yeats was a senator, but when he gave his passionate speech in favour of divorce, it fell on deaf ears for 6 decades. One of the ministers in the new government, Kevin O'Higgins, had called himself and his colleagues
the most conservative revolutionaries.
Coins say a lot about a country. And now, just 3 years after the Civil War, the government decided to introduce a new coinage for the new state, so that it could have
a coinage distinctively our own.
Ireland was replacing the king's head with the harp, the first dominion to remove the king from its coins. But Ireland planned to stay within the stability of sterling, and the coinage was to be manufactured at the Royal Mint in London, at the heart of the empire. The Minister for Finance, Ernest Blythe, appointed a 5-man Coinage Committee to advise on design. And Yeats was to be the chairman. In the Senate, he had called stamps and coins
the silent ambassadors of national taste.
And he wanted the Free State to have the best ambassadors. Yeats was part of the establishment, socialising with ministers like Kevin O'Higgins. Yet he also felt that he'd nothing in common with the new rulers of the country. Yeats had learned his political skills in the culture wars at the Abbey Theatre. So with the Coinage Committee, Yeats was on home ground and in control. By July 1926, the committee had decided that every single one of the new coins would bear an Irish animal.
What better symbols could we find for this horse-riding, salmon-fishing, cattle-raising country?
A brave move in a country which has always been very sensitive, not to say paranoid, about how it's seen abroad. The Coinage Committee met throughout the summer of 1926. At the same time, Yeats was working on one of his finest collections, The Tower. It contained his masterpiece, Sailing to Byzantium.
This is no country for old men, the young in one another's arms.
The Coinage Committee decided to hold an international design competition. The invitation list did include 3 Irish artists, but artists like the Italian master Morbiducci and the Croatian sculptor Mestrovic were international stars, and they showed remarkable goodwill towards the new Irish state. Finding the artists was a bit problematic. The designer of the Buffalo Nickel, James Earl Fraser, politely declined because he'd received the invitation too late. Mestrovic did not receive his instructions at all. The designs arrived in Dublin in February 1927. 66 prototypes were laid out for the committee to examine, and the names of the 7 artists were hidden. The committee voted coin by coin, fully expecting to choose designs from 3 or 4 artists. It was no secret, mainly because he'd blabbed about it himself, that Yeats favoured the Swedish artist, Carl Mila. But when all the votes were counted, it turned out that the committee had unanimously chosen the work of a single outstanding designer. There was only one problem with this single outstanding designer. He was English. Percy Metcalfe was from Yorkshire. His father was a mechanic. After art school in Leeds, Metcalfe fought in the First World War as a gunner in the Royal Artillery. He was so badly wounded that he had to give up sculpture because he couldn't stand for long periods. So he worked on war memorials, the new growth industry, and he became a medalist. He was determined, he was a survivor. He was 32 years old.
Not only do we consider that his designs are incomparably superior to the other designs entered for the competition, but we regard them as being of outstanding excellence and as certain to provide a coinage of unusual interest and beauty.
Metcalfe was also cheap. As the youngest and least well-known of the artists, he proposed charging the Irish government 1/5 of what some of the senior artists had wanted for the job. It looked like everything was good to go, but there was trouble behind the scenes. Faced with Metcalfe's modern designs, the government lost its nerve. The Executive Council, or Cabinet, drew up its own list of favourite designs from the competition. The President of the Executive Council, William Cosgrave, wanted only Irish artists. Everybody had an opinion. Worse still, the government appointed a livestock inspector from the Department of Agriculture to advise Metcalfe on design.
We awaited the results with alarm.
Metcalfe's prancing bull grew slower because the livestock inspector, Mr. Toomey, had called the original
All wrong.
He advised Metcalfe to look at a Kerry bull and to go for instruction to the Wolfhound Club. The pig's jowl was too big, her tail was too low, and the bonnet's legs were too long.
I sigh over the pig,
said Yeats later. All this meddling infuriated the Coinage Committee.
We have instead querulous and harassed animals, better merchandise, but less living.
Mr. Toomey's alterations went on for almost a year. But, despite all the interference, the coins were eagerly anticipated, even by the government. In the summer of 1927, as Metcalfe worked to make 4 of his designs worse, President Cosgrave wanted to give photos of the new coins to the great Irish tenor, John McCormack. But this was not permitted. In 1927, the Civil War was still close. On July the 10th, the rising star of the government, Minister Kevin O'Higgins, was gunned down in a Dublin suburb. O'Higgins, who during the Civil War had signed the death warrants of so many of his former comrades, bled to death later that day. In October 1927, the Coinage Committee resigned en masse after discovering that Metcalfe had been briefed by 2 government ministers behind its back. The Secretary of the Department of Finance had to write to Yeats personally to ask that the resignations be withdrawn. This letter is the only written evidence of that major row. There was no record of it in the minutes of the Coinage Committee. And so the committee meetings resumed as if nothing had happened. But in the autumn of 1927, Yeats wrote a new poem, Blood and the Moon.
Is every modern nation like the Tower, half dead at the top?
When the coins were issued in December 1928, there was an outcry from predictable quarters. In Unfoblucht, Maud Gonne, Yeats's great love, who had herself been born in England, condemned the coinage as
designed by an Englishman, minted in England, representative of English values, paid for by the Irish people.
An anonymous member of the clergy wrote to the Irish Independent that the coinage was
the thin end of the wedge of Freemasonry. It will beget a land of devil worshippers.
Unfortunately, that never happened. Vodia of Dublin wrote,
Beastly is the only suitable word I can find to express my opinion of the new coinage designs. Is there anything more humiliating than to hear an Irishman called a pig? Who is it addresses us so? The answer is the foreigner, the Englishman.
And Irish America was particularly upset.
Sir, astonishment and indignation has been expressed from all natures of the Irish in New York, from the humblest laborer to the highest judge, upon learning of the absence from the new Irish coinage of any reference to Almighty God.
Nevertheless, the new coins had caught the public imagination. At home, the very thing that made them controversial, a menagerie, the barnyard collection, also made them loved.
I am a small farmer in Mayo and have been dealing with domestic animals all my life. They are my daily bread. I am not sentimental, but practical. I like to see them on our coinage.
Percy Metcalfe, modest as ever, wrote to the Department of Finance asking if he could buy some presentation sets of the new coins. The government sent the coins all over the world. The Pope wrote to say thank you. And in a charming pamphlet for public consumption, Yeats explained that the coins had been designed
to please those who look longer at each coin than anybody else. Artists and children.
The coins were universally admired, a triumph for the new state. Percy Metcalfe went on to design coins for Iraq, Egypt, and Australia. He was the designer at the end of the empire. At the time of the launch, Yeats was in Italy and he didn't come home. In fact, the issuing of the Free State coinage marked Yeats's departure from the Senate. The new state was getting smaller in every sense. But on the coins, he knew he had won. In the fight to bring Ireland into the modern world, Yeats had, this time, broadly speaking, got what he wanted. The price was his silence. It was that rare thing, a victory for a poet.